Morale is going to be a bit less all or nothing in 9th edition, with bigger units taking some casualties but not getting completely wiped when they fail an important morale test. Let's talk about the preview rules. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we've been going over the 9th edition rules as they've come out. So Games Workshop teased that morale is going to be changed in a significant way fairly early in these 9th edition preview cycles, and now we know exactly how. The main change seems to be that small amounts of people will run away, rather than entire units going heading for the hills all at once. So let's have a talk about the new rules then. So I feel that morale in 40k has always been a little bit of a problematic mechanic in the game. Generally it's fairly unsatisfying to see your superhuman death machines or soulless automatons deciding that everything's getting a little bit too much for them and running straight off the board. It often has meant in the past that leadership issues are generally something that affects only a very select amount of Warhammer races, things like Imperial Guard, maybe Orcs in small numbers, and Forces of the Tau Empire, amongst a few others. In previous editions, you would have to take morale tests for certain units, then they would physically move off the board until you happened to make a test for them to regroup again. 8th edition very much simplified this by just having morale cause additional casualties in quite a simplistic way, basically rolling a dice and adding how many casualties the squad had taken that turn, then subtracting the squad's leadership, and if the result was a positive number, then that many models would flee. This meant that leadership had pretty much an all or nothing effect, where if you did fail a test, there was quite a high likelihood you'd fail it by quite a lot and just wipe out the rest of the unit due to them running away. There have been a few subtle changes to that system. First of all, the morale test does happen the same as before, so it basically means the more casualties that you take, the more likely you are to fail, with the slight exception being that if you roll a 1 on the test, then it always passes regardless of how many casualties you'd taken. Prior to this, even if you'd rolled a 1, then you'd still potentially be failing a test if you'd taken a lot of casualties on a low leadership unit. In general, this is going to be more of a buff to things like big units and hordes, as pretty much all elite units that have high leadership will never be failing a morale test on a 1 under normal circumstances. It would be more relevant if, say, you had a unit of 30 Imperial Guard conscripts, you lose 20 of them to enemy fire, then at least you've got at least a small chance of passing that morale test now. Now presuming that you have failed the morale test, then it means that one model will flee automatically, and then after that the rest of the unit, if there's anyone left, will take what's called a combat attrition test. Basically you'll roll 1d6 per model left in the unit, and for each roll of a 1, and for each roll of a 1, a model will flee. Furthermore, you have to subtract 1 from that test if the unit is now at less than half strength. So without any other modifiers, if a unit fails a morale test with half or more of its models still remaining, you'll lose 1 model plus a sixth of all the rest, though naturally you could roll a high or low. And if you fail at 1 when you have less than half the models remaining, you'll lose 1 model due to the failed test, and then 1/3 of all the models remaining, so a greater proportion will flee. But as the squad size is already reduced, then you will be taking that same test on fewer models than previously. So rather than having situations where you have entire units run away, that's now very rarely going to happen unless you roll exceptionally badly. At worst, you're likely to lose 1 person plus a third or a sixth of all the rest, meaning that unless there were literally only a couple of models left in the unit, you're pretty much guaranteed to have at least some models in the unit left after the morale phase. So what does this actually mean for us in game then? In general, the combination of these rules will vastly lessen the impact of morale on large units of models, things like hordes. Typically, if you were going to fail a morale test for them, it could often be failing it by quite a lot, and you could have a whole load of models run away, or the entire unit. Now you always at least have a 1 in 6 chance of passing the test outright, and even if you do fail, rather than losing an entire unit, you'll just be losing 1 model out of a whole load of them, plus a proportion of the rest, so you're not going to be losing entire units of hordes to the morale mechanic anymore. Combat attrition compared with every single model on the failed test fleeing is really quite a big bonus. However, for smaller units that only just fail a morale test, say things like Space Marines, if they have leadership 8 and you manage to roll a 9 on the morale test for example, they might actually feel the burn of morale just a little bit more than they did before. Basically in any test that you only just failed because of morale, say in that Space Marines example, you typically have only lost maybe 1 or 2 models at absolute maximum, but now thanks to combat attrition, you could actually lose quite a lot more than that. Actually failing the morale check by 1 point is going to have pretty much the same effect as to whether or not you failed it by a whole ton, so good leadership is now only really a bonus to the chance of passing the morale test. It's not a bonus to the amount of casualties you'll take once you've failed. If we did look at a very big unit though, say 30 cultists, if they took 16 casualties over the course of the turn, then they typically now only lose around about 5 of them to morale, as opposed to losing pretty much the rest of the unit, which they would have done before. I think the mechanic is also going to be quite kind to something like 10 model units with relatively poor leadership, things like Imperial Guardsmen. it's really quite easy to push over the edge for morale at the moment by, say, inflicting 6 or 7 casualties on the unit and then being pretty much guaranteed that either a decent amount of them or all of the rest of them will run away. They did note in their live stream today that was often a common tactic, sort of gaming the morale system. Basically, if you knew that you inflicted, say, 8 casualties on an Imperial Guard squad, no matter what you rolled, then the last 2 will be guaranteed to run away, or if you inflicted 7 casualties, then you'd only need to roll a 3 or more to make the last 3 run. That sort of calculation just isn't going to be quite as reliable now, as you'll be pretty much guaranteed to be able to inflict at least 1 more casualty on the unit, but the rest might be able to pass their combat attrition tests. It means that if you now want to inflict maximal casualties due to morale, then the aim will be to make the enemy units fail the test, but only by a small amount, as there's no real value in doing more than this. It means that if you are facing down an enemy horde, then it makes sense to shoot enough casualties to make sure they're pretty much guaranteed to fail their morale test, but then not inflict mass casualties beyond that, and then maybe move on to another unit to try and make them fail that morale test as well. I think this sort of morale test will certainly be helpful for some armies, particularly armies like Imperial Guard I think will be net beneficiaries of this, as will armies like Necrons in particular I think, as morale could be a real issue before by wiping out the rest of their squad and not allowing them to use their reanimation protocols. In general I would say that morale has got probably slightly weaker as a mechanic as a whole, which isn't really the best as there's a lot of ways of mitigating it in the game in the first place, but while it might not be all that much stronger in this system, I do think that this feels like a very intuitive way of doing it. Apparently from here on in as well, some mechanics will also worsen combat attrition, as well as the actual chance of failing the morale test, so there might still be some very strong morale shenanigans that some armies can play with. It'd be interesting to see what sort of things get those rules as the 9th edition codexes roll out. Overall, as a change, I think I am in favour on the whole. I think it is pretty much, as they've said, an easier mechanic to access and do meaningful damage to a unit with, but now it's really going to be a devastating mechanic in normal circumstances, where you can lose something like 10 to 15 models all in one go if you do take some mass casualties. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll have plenty more 9th edition content coming out as they release it. And if you have been enjoying all these updates, then I'd just like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which is down in the video description below. Making all of these videos does take quite a bit of time, so if you have been enjoying, then any contributions are of course greatly appreciated. Channel patrons get to see some videos on the channel early, there's regular polls to see what sort of videos the channel makes next, and there's regular monthly giveaways where I post out some miniatures to randomly selected patrons, no matter where they are in the world. This month it's 3 Guard Start collecting sets, and next month it's going to be 3 sets of Indomitors. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help keep these videos coming, then you can find the channel Patreon link down in the description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.